In today's video, we're going to be previewing the 2024 Tennessee Titans, looking at pretty much every player on the roster, comparing each position group to the rest of the NFL, and I've given every player in the NFL a rating from 65 to 99 following this rating scale. A 65 is a practice squad, bottom of the roster type of player. 99 is generational player in their prime, and in the right column, you can see the distribution across the NFL, how many players fall into each tier. Then I combine all of those ratings into offensive and defensive ratings based on this weighting table. So edge rusher, for example, makes up 23% of the defensive score, and the 1, 2, 3, and 4 on the depth chart are 75, 20, 4, and 1% of that score. And I've got the Titans as the 24th best team in the NFL, not a bottom feeder by any means, but a team with some questions and some holes on their roster. This tier of teams from 24 to 28, it's a razor thin margin between them. Like if I change a player from a 78 to a 79, it's affecting the rankings. But with a new coaching staff, a young quarterback that's still developing, and a lot of new additions in free agency and through the draft, I think there's plenty of upside for this team to be a playoff contender. I don't see them as a Super Bowl contender, but I definitely feel a lot more confident in them than I did last offseason. So we'll briefly look at their 2023 stats to start things off. When we average everything out, they had the 26th best offense in the NFL, and it's a really interesting statistical profile because looking at their overall offense, you can see the only things that they ranked in the top half of the league in are EPA per play and explosive play percentage. And that's very easy to see when you watch the 2023 Titans. Of any team in the NFL, they had the biggest difference between EPA per play and success rate. What that means is that they were able to generate big explosive plays that's going to drag the EPA per play number up, but they were not an efficient or effective offense on a snap-to-snap basis, which speaks to the low success rate. They ran the most trick plays of anyone in the NFL. They had a quarterback with a big arm that can push the ball down the field, but as far as just lining up and playing and trying to move the football, they didn't have good enough players to do that consistently. They had the second worst pressure rate and sack rate in the NFL. Over 43% of the Titans quarterbacks' dropbacks were under pressure, and they didn't really have receivers that could separate on a consistent basis. I think both of those should be improved in 2024. The running game was pretty good. They had a great running back duo, and for whatever negative things you want to say about the Titans offensive line, they didn't really struggle as run blockers. They still had the same split between explosive play rate and success rate, so a little bit more boom bust than you would want, but the running game was not what held the Titans offense back last year. And then defensively, again, they were really good stopping the run, but not a great pass defense, and that resulted in a slightly below average defense overall. They had the best red zone conversion rate in the NFL, but just didn't have the personnel, especially at corner and at pass rusher when Jeffrey Simmons went down with an injury, and they've invested a lot in that side of the ball, but I still think there are some holes on the defensive roster that they'll need to fill over the next couple years. Getting into the roster breakdown, I've got them with the 25th best offense in the NFL, and I went with a 76 for Will Levis, which is a slightly above average starter. With these young quarterbacks in their first or second year, it's pretty difficult to assign a number rating to them because there's such a wide range of outcomes. So I kind of defaulted to a conservative rating for Levis, Anthony Richardson, and then all the rookies. And there's some players such as Will Levis that I've done full film breakdowns on and given very detailed scouting reports of their strengths and weaknesses, and I'll be a little bit more brief on those guys. But I would say that I'm cautiously optimistic about Will Levis. I think he showed a lot of flashes in his rookie year with not much help from his surrounding core, and as a rookie quarterback, just showing flashes of what you can do, I think is perfectly acceptable in your first season in the NFL. But as you get more and more experience and get deeper into your career, the standard is going to gradually increase. Eventually, just showing flashes isn't enough. You need to put it all together into consistently high quality quarterback play. Levis has elite arm talent, I think top 5 in the NFL in terms of arm strength, velocity, release quickness. I don't think the accuracy was great. He showed flashes of high-end ball placement, but there were a good amount of catchable but inaccurate passes on his tape last year, but that's not really my biggest concern for Will Levis going forward. I think what he really needs to improve is the decision making. He only threw 4 interceptions last year, but he had 14 turnover worthy plays, a lot of plays where he got lucky or there was a dropped interception. He should have an easier time this year making clean decisions because he'll have receivers that can get open more consistently and hopefully a better offensive line. But you want to see him tone down the aggressiveness and have better awareness throwing into zone coverage especially. And then the big wild card is, can he get back to the playmaking that he showed in his second to last year at Kentucky? That was a big part of his game early in college, but he had turf toe his last year. He was injured in his rookie year at Tennessee, and he kind of had to turn into a statue in the pocket. There wasn't a lot of escapability and creativity outside of structure. That's the element of his game that I think could really raise his performance if he can unlock that. And then they signed Mason Rudolph in free agency. I think he's a perfectly capable backup. He started 4 games for the Steelers to end the season last year. I thought put out the best tape of his career in 2023. Not really a starting caliber player, but definitely an upgrade to Malik Willis. And despite losing Derrick Henry, I think running back is still the strength of this roster, and it's the only position group that they rank in the top half of the NFL. Tyjae Spears, in my opinion, is the most underrated player on this roster. I don't really understand why it's such a foregone conclusion that Tony Pollard is the RB1. I think Spears is such a complete running back that does everything at least a B to B plus level. He's incredibly elusive and dynamic in open space. When he catches the ball on a screen pass or breaks it out to the alley on an outside run, he's pretty much a guarantee to make the first defender miss. He has excellent start-stop ability, really quick and fluid in and out of cuts. Despite having slightly below average size, he actually has really good contact balance. He can bounce off of tackle attempts, keep his footing. On the surface, you might say that the Titans lack a power back or a short yardage back, and they definitely don't have anyone at Derrick Henry's level, but Tyjae Spears is perfectly capable in that role. He was actually tied with Derrick Henry for the highest success rate on short yardage attempts at 90%. He has good hands out of the backfield, just 2 drops last year on 67 targets. He's a shifty route runner and an excellent pass protector, especially for a rookie. He actually had the highest pass blocking grade in the NFL among qualifying running backs last year. So I can't really say enough good things about Tyjae Spears. I think he's the best offensive player on the Titans roster, and he's someone that can be on the field for all 3 downs. They signed Tony Pollard in free agency, which was surprising to me. I didn't expect them to make that kind of investment in the running back position, but I didn't have an issue with the signing at all. Tony Pollard has been one of my favorite players to watch over the last few years. He's similar to Tyjae Spears in a lot of ways. I think a little bit less power as a runner, but he can create explosive plays. He's elusive in the open field, gives you some value in the passing game. And when you look at his 2023 season, you've really got to split it into 2 halves and account for the fact that he was coming off of a serious leg injury. At the end of 2022, he fractured his left leg and had a high ankle sprain. And statistically, you can see that the first half of the season, he was still recovering from that injury. Weeks 1 through 10, he didn't rank in the top 24 in any of the major rushing stats. But then over the second half of the year, he was in the top 15 in everything except yards per attempt and top 10 in broken tackle rate, success rate, and EPA per attempt. I think Spears and Pollard is a really good 1-2 punch, and Pollard could even end up being better than the 81 rating that I gave him. From 2021 to 2022, he was arguably a top 5 to 7 running back, so I could see him returning to form. It's just hard with running backs. Once you see a drop off, you rarely see them bounce back fully. And then you could put Julius Chestnut as the 3rd running back, but I actually went with Dylan Johnson, who is a UDFA from the 2023 class out of Washington. I see him as a similar archetype of player as someone like Hassan Haskins, but I actually had a higher grade on Dylan Johnson. Just a solid, well-rounded, do-it-all type of running back with limited athletic upside, but you can trust him to make the correct reads, limit the negative plays. He pretty much never drops the ball. He's a good pass blocker. He's got good vision, very powerful and tough. He played through multiple injuries in the college football playoff. If I had to bet, I would say that Dylan Johnson makes the roster as the RB3. And then wide receiver was significantly upgraded with the additions of Calvin Ridley and Tyler Boyd. They still come in at 19th. There's so many good receiver rooms across the NFL, but not a group of receivers that's going to hold them back from being an effective offense. They signed Calvin Ridley, another player that I did a full breakdown on if you want to check that out. He's still one of the better route runners in the NFL, just in terms of how quickly he can get in and out of breaks. There's a a reason that back a few years ago, especially if you had an NFL receiver on your podcast and asked them to list the top 5 receivers, most of them would have Calvin Ridley in their top 5. That doesn't mean that he was actually a top 5 receiver, but from the people that watch his tape and can really appreciate the technical nuance, they all have a lot of respect for how he runs his routes. He's also a very good deep threat. He can separate vertically. His comeback routes are teach tape. So in terms of short to intermediate route running and speed down the field, Calvin Ridley gives the Titans 2 elements that they didn't really have with any of their other receivers. His ball skills are fairly inconsistent, a career 40% contested catch rate. His last 3 years of playing, he's had around an 8% drop rate each of those seasons. Comparing him to someone like Deontay Johnson, who's in a similar archetype of receiver, I would say Calvin Ridley is a slightly worse route runner and has slightly better hands. And then he isn't great against press coverage, but I disagree with the narrative that's become kind of widespread that he can't beat press. I think especially dating back to his Atlanta days, he's always been pretty good against press. Based on his reception perception data, he was around 75 to 79% success rate against press coverage every season. His 1 year in Jacksonville, that dropped down to 66.7%, which is a decline, but it's still 47th percentile. It's not like he's someone that can't get off of press coverage. I think you ideally want him at Z, but he's quick enough and precise enough with his footwork that he can be solid against press coverage. DeAndre Hopkins is a really solid wide receiver too. As he's gotten older, his game has dropped off in very specific areas. I've talked many times on this channel about his issues getting off of press coverage. I think that's by far the biggest thing holding his game back at this point in his career. If you give him soft shoe press where you're still lined up tight on the line of scrimmage, but you're not actually jamming him early, as long as he has that space to work with, he's a skilled enough route runner that he can manipulate that open space and still get open. But when you're aggressive, getting hands on him at the line of scrimmage, he's not really quick or explosive enough to punish you for overextending, and he's already lacking in speed, but making contact with him really slows down his route timing and limits his effectiveness. But he's still just a masterful zone coverage route runner. A lot of times people think about route running against zone coverage as just like running a dig route into open space or finding a soft spot in the zone and sitting down. There's a lot more nuance that goes into it. He understands how to attack blind spots. He knows how to use direction and stem depth to make a zone coverage defender think he's running one route and then zone off and create space. And he has great hands. He doesn't drop the ball. He can make contested catches. There's still a lot of things that DeAndre Hopkins does at a high level, but when it comes to winning on a quick slant against press man on 3rd and 5, he just can't do that at this point in his career, and he doesn't really give you any kind of vertical threat down the sideline unless he can win with a stop and go double move. And then Tyler Boyd is just a very solid slot receiver. Definitely had the worst year of his career since he kind of hit his prime in 2018. He isn't the most dynamic or explosive receiver, but just a technically sound route runner. For most of his career, he's had some of the most reliable hands in the NFL, and he still only had 3 drops last year, but a few of them came in incredibly inopportune times, just some back-breaking drops. He dropped the go-ahead touchdown against Houston in Week 10, but he was actually more productive after the catch in 2023 than he's ever been. He set his career high in forced missed tackles with 11. He's definitely on the downswing of his career, and I don't think he's quite the player that he once was, but still a starting caliber slot. My biggest issue with this top 3, though, is that they still don't have a true X. We've talked about Calvin Ridley. He can play X, but I think best suited at Z. DeAndre Hopkins did his best work in the slot. He's not someone that I want playing X. And then Tyler Boyd is a pure slot only. I've got Treylon Burks at wide receiver 4. I don't have a lot of expectations for him. He's a big receiver. He has good speed for his size, but his speed alone doesn't make him a super dynamic deep threat. He can win over the top occasionally, but watching him last year, most corners had no problem sticking with him down the field. He has never at any point in his career showed to be an effective intermediate route runner, and you can get by as that type of receiver if you have good hands, but he was not very effective in contested catch situations last year, just 2 for 7, and he had 4 drops on 29 targets. So at this point, he's like a slower Tyrell Williams, not someone that's particularly effective on the field. If he can improve his hands, then he could be a solid contributor, but you can't really have someone like him on the field with his lack of route running ability that also can't catch the the football. Nick Westbrook-Akine still on the roster. I expect him to make the team, but hopefully not a player that sees the field very often. And then Kyle Phillips can get open, but he's had a hard time staying healthy, and I think will probably be battling for a roster spot. The other player to mention is Jaquan Jackson, who they took in the 6th round. He's fast, but doesn't really add a whole lot else. He isn't great fighting through contact at the catch point, not a refined route runner, very little experience against press coverage. He could end up making the roster based on special teams, but I don't really see him contributing as a receiver this year at least. I think the tight end room is pretty solid. Chig had a down year statistically, but I still view as a really good tight end. He had slightly more receiving yards last year, but it was on over twice as many snaps as his rookie season. His yards per route run was cut in half. He was overall way less efficient, but I think there are two very clear explanations for why that happened. The first one is drops. He had 6 drops last year, 10% drop rate. Dating back to college, he's never had the most reliable hands, but it wasn't something that significantly held back his game, and the drop issues did improve as the year went on. He had 4 drops in the first half of the year, 2 in the second half. That's something he's got to fix, obviously, but I think it's a mental thing, and hopefully he can bounce back from that. The second, and I think primary reason he was less productive last year is that he was listed as a tight end, but he was basically the assistant offensive tackle. Tennessee had 2 tight ends in the top 22 in the NFL in pass blocking snaps. Trevon Wesco actually ranked first with 108. The next highest was 86, but that doesn't tell the whole story with Chig because it doesn't account for all of the times he was asked to provide chip help. If you stay in for a few seconds to chip block and then release on a route, PFF charts that as a receiving snap. It doesn't chart it as a pass blocking snap, and there isn't a place that has chip blocking data publicly available, but I haven't seen a tight end that was asked to do more chip help than Chig was. And the effect of that is that your routes are either going to be too slow developing for the quarterback to have time to get to you in their progression. Being asked to chip block so often, it basically made him like the worst receiver in the NFL against press coverage, where he just can't get off the line of scrimmage for the quarterback to even look his way. But then on top of that, it limits his route depth to pretty much an 8-yard sit route. He doesn't have time for any kind of downfield route to develop, and that's obviously a major aspect of Chig game because he's so fast. There were still some plays that he got the ball on a delayed release as a check down, but a lot of wasted reps where he had no chance of being targeted. If the pass blocking can improve enough that they can get him the ball on more downfield routes this year, I still think he's a really dynamic weapon. He's a good route runner. He's tough to bring down with the ball in his hands. I don't think that his dip in production and efficiency last year should have you concerned about his long-term outlook, but he does have some limitations as a run blocker, and I think there's a lot of misconceptions when we talk about tight end run blocking. For all intents and purposes, there are basically 2 tight end positions. You've got the Y, which is the bigger tight end that's going to have his hand in the ground. He's in line blocking defensive ends. And then you've got the flex H-back move tight end, which is the Chig Kyle Pitts types. They're going to be lined up in the slot, in the backfield, or attached to the Y slightly off the line of scrimmage. And their primary blocking assignments are going to be linebackers and defensive backs because they're smaller players. So when Chig gets matched up with a player of similar size, he's a pretty effective run blocker, but he's not really a player that you want in line blocking someone that weighs 40 pounds more than him. And that could be something that keeps him off the field when the Titans go 11 personnel, which was Brian Callahan's favorite personnel in Cincinnati. When you go 11 personnel, you want to be able to have the threat of running or passing. And this play against the Colts is a great example of what happens when you try to put Chig on the line of scrimmage and have him block a defensive end. He gets uprooted, blows up the entire play. So I think that could open up a lot of opportunities for Josh Whyle, who was a 5th round pick in 2022. A lot of people have said this, but I agree that there's a good chance Josh Whyle actually outsnaps Chig He has the size and physical profile to hold up in the run game, but he can also, I think, add some value as a pass catcher. He showed some nice flashes as a rookie. Most of it was kind of just wide open running down the seam, but that's what a lot of tight end routes are. It's hard to be too confident in a player with 94 career receiving yards, but I think he has the skill set to be the starting Y for this offense. And then Nick Vannett is a pure blocking specialist that gives you nothing in the receiving game, pretty interchangeable with someone like Jeff Swaim or Trevon Wesco. The offensive line is still the main thing that's holding back this this offense for me. I have them with the second worst offensive line in the NFL, but amazingly, I think they've actually improved their offensive line from last season. It's been an incredible run of historically bad offensive line play, especially historically bad left tackle play for the Titans. Going back to 2022, they had Dennis Daly, and this graphic has some different plots for different statistics. Every point is an individual season from a player, so one point would be Dennis Daly 2022, another one would be Dennis Daly 2023, and he was in the first or second percentile in PFF blocking grade, PFF pass blocking grade, sack rate, and he was fourth percentile in pressure rate. We all saw that season and said there's no way it could get any worse than this, but then they signed Andre Dillard and somehow it was even worse. He was below first percentile in pressure rate. He had the second highest sack rate of any offensive tackle since 2006, and we were all like, okay, it finally hit rock bottom. This is as bad as it could possibly get. But then Jalen Duncan said, hold my beer, and he put up arguably the worst offensive tackle season in recorded history. He had the highest sack rate and highest pressure rate ever for an offensive tackle. He had the lowest PFF pass blocking and PFF blocking grade ever, and it's not like he really made up any of that value in the run game. So the Titans invested their first round pick in J.C. Latham out of Alabama, a prospect that I really liked. I think you still got to be cautious expecting too much from a rookie offensive tackle, but I feel very confident that he'll be a significant upgrade to what they've had the last two seasons. He's one of the strongest offensive linemen that I've ever evaluated, just an impenetrable anchor, but he's also very skilled with his hands. He does a great job of keeping himself out of compromising positions, and then when he does get his hands on you, he has elite grip strength to maintain contact. He is more of an average athlete in terms of foot speed, so I worry some about inside counters when pass rushers cross his face, but I love that pick, and I think for the long term, he'll be a really quality left tackle. And really the whole left side of the offensive line should be pretty solid. Peter Skoronski had an up and down rookie season. He did a lot of nice stuff in the run game. The refined hand usage that he showed at Northwestern translated immediately to the NFL, but he needs to get a lot stronger. He had issues last year dealing with power rushes, and he also struggled at times with his footwork moving from tackle to guard. You know, there's different techniques setting against a 3-tech or a 2-eye than there is on the outside. I expect him to be an above average starter, but he is a player that you're banking on taking a pretty significant step forward. And then they signed Lloyd Cushenberry at center, who will be an upgrade to Aaron Brewer, at least as a pass blocker. I think Brewer still gives you more in the run game, but Cushenberry's probably the best pass blocker on this offensive line. He has a solid anchor. He's great with his hands. He can slide his feet. Smart player when it comes to picking up stunts and diagnosing blitzes. From center to left tackle, I think it's realistic for the Titans to not have a weak spot, but the right side of the offensive line is where it starts to get really dicey. They don't have set starters at either of these spots. I've got Dylan Radins and NPF penciled in there right now, but I could see a lot of different combinations. Dylan Radins showed to be a replacement level offensive lineman last year. He had some really nice plays in the run game. That pancake from week 2 against the Chargers still sticks out to me as his best block of the season, and PFF graded him as one of the better run blockers in the NFL. I didn't really think he was that good, but still a strength of his game for sure. And as a pass blocker, I definitely wouldn't say he's good, especially at offensive tackle, but he's developed to where he isn't bad enough that he's going to ruin your offense. When he's playing offensive tackle, I still think he's very inconsistent getting to his set points, allows a lot of avoidable pressure around the corner, and his punch is just a little bit too late and soft to where he allows power rushers to get into his frame. That's going to be an issue whether he plays tackle or guard. He did show a lot of improvement mirroring inside counters. I was really impressed with that aspect of his game, but I still think a below average pass blocker regardless of which position he plays. NPF still has a lot of natural talent. I think as much upside as anyone that's competing for these two spots. He's dealt with injuries, didn't really have much tape last year, but when you look at his career, just his one-on-one blocking snaps, like he's probably below average to average. What really kills NPF is just a lack of awareness and way too many lapses in technique. He's probably the player who I'm most excited to see if he can take a jump under Bill Callahan. We mentioned Jalen Duncan. He put out some of the worst offensive line tape that I've ever seen last season. I know he's a developmental player, but I don't really view him as an NFL caliber offensive lineman. He has pretty much no anchor, no resemblance of technique with his hands. I don't think he makes the roster, and I think you could easily find better options for the practice squad even. Daniel Brunskill is like the NWI of offensive guards. He's fine if you've got to have him on the field. There's going to be some bad losses, but he's an acceptable backup guard. They traded a 7th round pick for Leroy Watson. I watched his one career start against the Bengals in week 18, and it was fine. He seems to have a lot of athletic upside and natural talent. Definitely an intriguing developmental prospect. He had a really nice snatch trap, but it's kind of hard to evaluate the pass blocking snaps. They were getting the ball out so quickly. The Browns were calling that game like they had 2 backup tackles in. There were a lot of aggressive jump sets that would cause him to get beat around the corner. And in the run game, he had a few nice blocks out in space, but also a few reps where he fell down and didn't have great balance. And they also signed Sadiq Charles, who was the weak spot on a bad Washington offensive line. Another player with a lot of athletic upside. He's got some good recovery skills moving laterally, but he has a very weak anchor. He lost to power consistently, and for a 5th-year player, I can't be that confident in them adding play strength. As with all of these developmental players, we're going to see the Bill Callahan effect. I could definitely see one of these guys surprising and taking a big jump based on what they've put on tape, but I can't just say like this is a bad player, but they signed Bill Callahan, so he's going to automatically be good. They've also got Jerron Christian, a career journeyman backup tackle. John Ojukwu was a UDFA last year. He got some snaps, a lot of them at inline tight end as a 6th offensive lineman. I thought he had a couple nice reps in the run game, had some issues in pass pro, but a very small sample size. And Andrew Rupsich, another UDFA at guard, actually really impressed me with some of his run blocking reps. I couldn't fit him on the graphic, but I was pleasantly surprised with what he showed, and he could be a dark horse candidate to make the roster. Moving on to the defense, which is going to rank 23rd in the NFL. The edge rushers are also going to rank 23rd, and I think the top 2 are solid, passable edge rushers. Harold Landry started off last season very slow, clearly still recovering from the injury, but about mid-year you could really see an uptick in his production and level of play overall. He returned to form. The first 6 weeks before the bye week, he had 6 pressures total, and then the final 11 games after the bye week, he had 41 pressures, so night and day difference. I still think he's kind of a limited player as your number 1 pass rusher. He has a pretty solid ghost move where you're flashing the hand, trying to get the tackle to overextend, and then you dip around the outside shoulder, and he's got the explosiveness and the bend to win with that 1 to 2 times a week. He had a really nice ghost move sack against Austin Jackson for the Dolphins, and then you see him right here beating Abraham Lucas around the corner. He got a sack against Houston's backup tackle with the ghost rip, so it's a solid move for him, but he still never developed any kind of bull rush. His speed to power just doesn't go anywhere, so he's not really a player that's going to apply consistent pressure on a snap-to-snap basis. It's going to be a lot of empty snaps and then 1 or 2 big plays every game. That's fine as a complementary second edge rusher, but it really limits him from being a true number 1. He is a very underrated run defender, and on stunts and cleanup sacks and pressures, he's athletic, he's got a good motor, so he can rack up a lot of production there. And then Arden Key is a different player, but has kind of similar outcomes in terms of his pass rushing production. He isn't a consistent impact player as a pass rusher, but he'll have some dominant flashes. I would say even more dominant than Harold Landry. He started out week 1 with 8 pressures and 2 sacks, but it turns out that Trevor Penning's just bad. But then he had some incredible reps against the Panthers, just worked Ike Ekwonu around the corner. He got a strip sack and then wins with a double swipe and crushes Bryce Young. And then the Seahawks game was another dominant performance. A ghost move sack against Charles Cross. Really nice play here to dent this lead block, push him back into Kenneth Walker, but he just doesn't have a great power profile and kind of gets blanked in a lot of matchups. So again, he's more of a secondary pass rusher. So the top 2 is fine. The real problem is that they have pretty much no depth. Rashad Weaver is a very ineffective pass rusher. He's kind of a limited athlete, and coming out of Pittsburgh, he was really technically sound, had a lot of different moves, but he's just too stiff, not precise enough with his hands to win with those at the NFL level. And he finished with 7 pressures on 130 pass rushing snaps last season. And then Caleb Murphy and Jalen Harrell have proven nothing. Can't really expect them to contribute much. I did like Jalen Harrell as a swing in the 7th round, but definitely more of a a developmental player. It is a very good interior defensive line led by Jeffrey Simmons, one of the best 3 techniques in the NFL. The one thing that we still need to see from Jeffrey Simmons is the ability to stay healthy and put together a full season of elite play. The last 2 years, he's started off the first half of the season looking like a top 4 to 5 defensive tackle, but then he's gotten injured and either missed time or been on the field, but playing at like 70% strength. I really don't have many criticisms of his game. I think he's a complete player, good power rusher, very skilled with his hands. He's the caliber of defensive tackle that can be your number 1 guy as a pass rusher, but for the last couple years, by week 8 or 9, you can't really count on him to provide that. And then T'Vondre Sweat, I've spoken a lot about the draft pick, not a pick that I would have made. Based on all the publicly available information, it just seemed like too much of a risk in the top 40 for me at least. But having never met him, I'm not, married to that take, willing to let him prove me wrong. Hopefully that happens. On the field, I think he should be a solid starting caliber nose tackle. He can hold the point in the A gap. With Sweat and Simmons, that's a really good duo that I think is the strongest position group on this roster. But then I also like some of the depth. I think Sebastian Joseph Day is a really solid rotational player. He's very skilled with his hands in the run game. He's able to slip blocks, club, and knife through gaps. He reads the play quickly, does a good job of anticipating and deconstructing blocks, and he can make some plays in the backfield. He doesn't have a great anchor. He will get moved out of his gap occasionally, so definitely a player that needs to be moving forward and getting ahead of things. And then I thought his pass rushing tape was pretty underwhelming. He'll get some pursuit and cleanup sacks, but doesn't really have much of a bull rush and doesn't have the athleticism to really threaten the edge. But still, you could do a lot worse than him as your 3rd defensive lineman. And then Marlon Davidson and Keandre Coburn got some playing time late in the season. I thought they both showed flashes. Davidson's kind of similar to Sebastian Joseph Day. He's a little bit undersized, doesn't have a very good anchor. I think he has probably a worse anchor, but is more athletic and gives you more as a pass rusher. So I feel really good about the interior defensive line, 3rd best in the NFL. But the Titans' biggest weakness defensively is linebacker. They've got a lot of options, but none of them that I feel very confident in. They signed Kenneth Murray in free agency, really the one free agent signing that I did not agree with. And I finished watching every snap of his 2023 season for this video, and my opinion didn't really change. I think he's one of the worst starting linebackers in the NFL. He has really good size and he is very fast. So when he's going downhill on a run blitz or something, he can make some plays in the backfield. He's actually a pretty consistent tackler, and at his size, he can stack and shed blocks as long as he sees them coming. I think if you get him in a specialized, just fully downhill role where he's in attack mode, he can give you some solid play, but his processing issues in both phases really prevent him from playing fast. In the run game, he's slow to diagnose, so that puts him a step behind the block development. There's way too much indecisiveness and false steps, and he ends too many plays stuck behind blocks. Even when he triggers on the run, he doesn't do a good job of anticipating blocks, so he gets blindsided a lot and doesn't have his hands ready to engage. There's a lot of plays where it kind of looks like he's passive, but I don't think it's a lack of aggressiveness or physicality. It's just that he doesn't see the block coming. He has poor gap integrity. He'll over pursue, give up cutback lanes on the backside, and he didn't have too many issues staying on his feet. There were a couple knockdowns in the Vikings game, but he has really good play strength, so he's usually just stuck to the block, but at least he's upright. And then the coverage was even worse. I mean, he's as bad of a cover linebacker as I've watched. He'll make a couple nice plays crashing downhill on screen passes and stuff out in the flat, but when it comes to downfield coverage, you cannot trust him at all. In zone coverage, he just spot drops to a patch of grass, stands still, and stares at the quarterback. This play against the Packers, you can see when he gets into his hook drop, he barely moves at all for like 5 seconds as Jordan Love's breaking out of the pocket. Dontavian Wicks is just having a picnic behind him. Murray has no idea what's going on. He gets manipulated by the quarterback's eyes. It's very easy to just sneak a dig route behind him and it'll go completely uncovered. He doesn't have the recognition of route concepts or the natural sense for routes developing behind him. He doesn't do a good job of squeezing adjacent routes in zone coverage. There were a lot of third and short, third and mediums where he's dropping into the hook. He's got a sit route developing right at the sticks that should be in his field of vision, but he's so late to break on it. And then he's fast in a straight line, but he really struggles to turn and run with routes down the seam. I think part of that also comes down to route recognition. You see this play, he's late to take his eyes off of the quarterback. TJ Hawkinson outruns him down the middle. Right here, Tony Pollard gets a couple steps of separation on this wheel route, but it's overthrown. Linebacker is a position where, you can get away with not having great linebackers, but if you've got a bottom 3 linebacker room like I think the Titans have, it can really hold your defense back. And we do see with these athletic former first-round linebackers, the first 3 seasons of their career, they're not good, and then all of a sudden they put things together and have a breakout season. That could happen with Kenneth Murray, but I'll believe it when I see it. And then Jack Gibbens is kind of the polar opposite as a player. He's consistently in the right spot. He reads the play quickly, doesn't get fooled by misdirection very often. On 90 to 95% of snaps, you're either not going to notice him or he'll actually be a good player. But then there's a couple high leverage moments where he's got to beat someone to the corner, win a pursuit angle, or he's got to carry a fast receiver down the seam, and you really see his lack of speed show up. I think you can live with Gibbens as your second best linebacker, but there's just a real cap on the level of play that he can give you. I really like Cedric Gray as a prospect. I'll put his scouting report on the screen. It would surprise me if he was a major contributor in year 1, but could be a quality starter down the line. You want him to add some play strength, but he has a really good blend of coverage ability, athleticism, and play recognition. And then Otis Reese is a player that could surprise and actually win a starting role. He played in 3 games towards the end of last season, and I thought he put out some really good tape. He's a converted safety, I believe, listed at 214 pounds. He is undersized for sure, but just watching him on tape, he looks a lot bigger than 214. He's really athletic, plays with a very high motor, and seems to be a capable coverage player, but small sample size. We'll see if he can make the roster and carve out some sort of role. I've got cornerback as the second best positional group on this roster, 6th best in the NFL. They completely remade this cornerback room in the offseason. They trade for L'Jarius Sneed, who's a top 10 outside corner, probably the best pure press corner in the NFL. Just looking at what he does within 5 yards of the line of scrimmage, there's nobody that's as physical and as dominant with his press jam as L'Jarius Sneed. Everybody's seen that rep against Tyreek Hill, but he had equally impressive reps against DJ Moore, Garrett Wilson. I think he's good, not great in terms of downfield man coverage. Kansas City's scheme kind of protected him because they ran a lot of 2-man or cover 5, so he could just get into trail technique and not worry about getting beat vertically. He's a player that will give up some plays. He'll gamble, miss with his jam at the line of scrimmage, and get beat over the top. But overall, it's going to equal out to just really good cornerback play because pretty much every other rep, he's going to erase the team's number 1. Roger McCreary was probably the only young player on the Titans roster that improved last season. Moving to the slot, he was incredibly sticky in man coverage. He didn't get a lot of ball production like interceptions and pass breakups, but just really consistent snap after snap. You still see some plays where his lack of length will show up at the catch point and he'll have some close misses on the ball, but he's a very underrated player and could take another step forward this year. He also gives you a lot of value in the run game. And then their cornerback 2 is Chidobe Awuzie, who they signed from Cincinnati. He's been one of my favorite corners to watch over the last few years, but his 2023 tape took a major step back. He tore his ACL in 2022, so it's completely understandable that he would have a drop off in play the next season. And you do see a lot of times the second year after a major injury, they kind of return to form. So hopefully that's what happens, but it is kind of a gamble that his drop off in play was solely based on the injury and not age regression. Just looking at his 2023 tape, I mean, there were times he was a liability for the Bengals secondary. He got beat down the field constantly, struggled to recover, really seemed to have lost a step. I think a lot of people are just assuming that he's going to be what he was a couple years ago, and that could be the case, but it's a pretty major question mark in my opinion. Jarvis Brownlee is like a mini L'Jarius Sneed, probably the most physical and aggressive corner in the 2023 class. Every snap, he's just trying to end the receiver in front of him at the line of scrimmage. The downfield coverage, I think, needs a lot of work. He is very reliant on winning with his press jam. He has average speed. He's kind of inconsistent, mirroring and sticking to route breaks, but he's a smart player, had a great Senior Bowl. I think really good developmental pick on day 3. They've got Trey Avery as cornerback 5. He's shown some flashes throughout his career, especially against weaker competition, but the shine's kind of worn off the penny for him. His matchup against the Seahawks receivers in week 16 was a massacre. He isn't very decisive or confident with his technique and off coverage. I don't think he has the physical traits to really succeed in press man. And when you get into the red zone, I mean, a jump ball against Trey Avery is pretty much automatic. He might make the roster, but not a player that you really want on the field. And then Caleb Farley, just a very unfortunate career so far. Don't even have really any comments on him as a football player, but it would surprise me if he made the roster. I think Eric Garror is probably a more likely bet. Some athletic limitations, but there were some flashes of nice tape last year. So the depth isn't great, but I think the top three is really good as long as Awuzie doesn't drop off a cliff. And if he gets back to the level he was playing at in 2022, this could be a dominant starting three corners. And then safety is solid. I've got them 22nd in the NFL. It's a similar position to linebacker where you just can't be one of the worst 2 or 3 teams. I don't think Hooker and Molden are going to be huge strengths of this defense, but probably not going to be liabilities either. Amani Hooker, I do think, is one of the more underrated players on this defense, even by Titans fans. Pretty much all of his bad reps over the last few years really have been man coverage against a receiver. If you remove those plays and you just look at his deep zone coverage, actually playing the safety position, you look at his run defense, he's a high quality starting safety, just like Kevin Byard was in his prime. If you give him just average outside corners, he can make plays on the ball, but he does so much that doesn't show up in the stat sheet simply by not busting coverages. Until you actually watch the tape, it doesn't really register, but it's just snap after snap. He's in the right position. He's picking up the correct route, passing things off. Now that they actually have players that can play man coverage on wide receivers and Amani Hooker can play his natural position, I think he's going to be really good this year. Elijah Molden is still not really a safety to me, but that's going to be the position that he plays. I like him as a run defender in the box. Despite his size, he's really quick to trigger to the football, doesn't lack physicality in any way. He's a solid tackler, doesn't get out of position, so love him as a run defender. And then he can give you some nice things in man coverage, especially covering intermediate routes, sticking to route breaks within, 20 yards, but he doesn't have very good speed and he has a hard time turning his hips, gearing up to recover down the field. And on top of that, I don't think he has good eyes in deep zone coverage playing the safety position. He gave up this touchdown to the Colts that PFF actually didn't credit him for, but Mike Vrabel confirmed the Monday after that it was his fault, just a simple quarters coverage bust. And then he should have given up a touchdown to Calvin Ridley on a similar sort of play where he just lets a deep post over the top in quarters coverage. I think more experience playing safety and better play recognition can help him limit this sort of thing to a certain extent, but he's still a player that I have concerns with getting beat over the top. And when you look at it from an opposing offensive coordinator's perspective, when they look at this secondary, he's the clear weak link that they're going to attack. Mike Brown got some snaps last year. I actually thought he was pretty solid on, again, very limited sample size. I would have him as the third safety right now, and purely based on what he's shown, he seems like a pretty solid backup. And then Shaheem Carter has played 24 career snaps, so really no idea what he can do. There's a lot of talk about potentially adding Justin Simmons, and I do think that would be a no-brainer signing, but I don't think his 2023 tape was very good, and I believe there's a reason that it's mid-July and he still is unsigned. Again, there's no reason not to bring him in. They have no proven safety depth, and he could even be a better option than Elijah Molden, but I don't think he's what he was a couple years ago. So that's going to do it for the Titans preview. Got them as the 24th best team in the NFL. It's such a boring cop-out thing to say, but it really does all come down to Will Levis. If he takes a big jump and is a consistent, high-quality, top half of the league quarterback, the Titans could be a lot better than the 24th best team in the NFL. And if the Bill Callahan effect is transformative and they end up having the 16th best offensive line, that would obviously have a major impact as well. But at this point, I view right tackle and the linebackers as my biggest concern heading into next year.